Everyone, good afternoon, good morning if you're coming in from the West Coast. So happy to have you all. My name is Rachel Lieblein-Gerbala. I am the Programs Manager at the Spencer Educational Foundation, and we are just very excited to have Tony Chimera here with us today for his presentation, The Two Towers of Career Development, Networking and Branding. And for those of you who are current students, I know you've either finished finals last week or are currently in the thick of it right now. So I know this is a very crazy time, and I really appreciate you all joining, and I hope this will be a really fun session for you all. I have a couple of notes of housekeeping before I pass it over to Tony. The first is, if you wouldn't mind in the chat just popping in your name and where you're calling in from, that would be awesome. We'd love to see where folks are in the world that are in this room today. And secondly, if you do feel comfortable putting your video on, of course, no pressure to do so, but we'd love to see some faces if possible. And then lastly, I just wanted to give a brief reminder. I know everyone knows the drill at this point. How many Zoom meetings have we been on? But please mute yourself when you're not speaking. And Tony has, and will mention this himself, but he is happy to take questions and answers both throughout the session and at the end. So feel free to pop those questions in the chat as we go, and or just raise your hand and unmute yourself throughout, and we can have this be a very interactive conversation. So with that, Tony, I'm going to pass it over to you. Tony is I'm going to give you a brief introduction, and then you can give yourself the full go over. So Tony is the Senior Vice President and Global Head of Talent at Sompo International. He has held a number of human resources positions before joining Sompo in, I believe, 2013. Tony, am I correct?
You're correct.
Awesome. And he is currently calling in from Alpharetta, Georgia. He originally received his bachelor's from Auburn University, if I'm correct, and his MBA from University of Georgia. So I don't know if we have any University of Georgia folks on the line, but fellow alma mater. All right, and with that, Tony, the floor is yours. Thank you so much for being here.
I appreciate the intro. Thank you. Okay, well, a couple things here. Number one, let me make sure I can get the slides to work. So I'm having an issue with that. There we go. All right, so apologies. I'm going to lead off by saying first, I'm a pacer and a stander, so you guys are getting me kind of on a chair here. So if I get a little animated, just expect that. I think we're gonna have a good discussion, and I appreciate you guys making the time. First off, I thought I'd cover off a couple things before getting to the topic at hand. And we're in the middle of a pandemic, so after a brief intro, I'm going to talk a little bit about COVID, because I think it's interesting for you guys maybe to hear about what we've seen from a company perspective. Then we'll shift to choosing a career in an industry, talk about networking, branding, brand management, and then Q&A. But I'd say in advance, if you guys have questions, as was said, you're not going to slow me down too much. Ask them as you go, and we'll address those. So you did a great job introducing me, so I'm not going to belabor it, except I'll highlight a couple things. Number one, I am a huge sports fan, and every sports team that I root for has kind of a mixed history, starting with the Buffalo Bills. We're hoping to end that this year. But I had to pick between Auburn and Georgia. I chose Georgia. So I'm a Dog fan. I'm a Buffalo Sabres fan. What all those franchises have in common is they've never really won anything while I've rooted for them. So, choose your sports teams carefully. In addition to being at Endurance, and now it's called Sompo International, I spent some time at Axis. So I looked up and suddenly realized I've spent kind of half of my career in P&C insurance. So you'll see that in some of the information I'm going to share. But I thought I'd talk about the company that I work for currently. It's kind of a well-kept secret. Again, it used to be a company called Endurance. Then we were bought by a Japanese company called Sompo, and we became Sompo International. We're a leading global specialty provider of insurance and reinsurance. We have professionals around the globe, really for the businesses that I support, which is the insurance practice, primarily London, Bermuda, and a variety of locations in the US. Our culture, and I'll talk about culture in this deck. Integrity, teamwork, agility, execution, and excellence is the way that I define our culture and the way that we define our culture. And I think the important thing, and for those of you that are on the fence maybe about this industry, we don't make anything. We're all about the people. And for SI, the people are the most important thing. You know, I always say talent wins, and I really believe that. You need capital, you need, you know, the infrastructure, but you either have talent or you don't. And I think that's one thing that I'd have you take away from this presentation is you guys are talent either in the industry or coming into the industry. You can make a difference in the companies that you join. And then I think it's contingent on the companies that you do join to present you with opportunities to learn and to grow and to develop. And last but not least, you know, I'll talk a little bit about diversity and inclusion. You know, I think one of the things out of this pandemic that I'd say is it's highlighted something that's been out there for a while, but I think it's shifted inclusivity and diversity and inclusion from an idea and a thing that's good to do to something that has to become actionable. And again, we'll talk about that as we go through this a little bit. So I think why don't we, before we jump into this, why don't we do a quick polling question on demographics? Can we do that right now? There we are.
Can everyone see it? Yeah, great.
Thanks, Rachel. All right, I'm going to keep going and not pause too long on this. We'll come back to the results in a sec. So I talked about this earlier, you know, the wonderful pandemic that we're in. What's changed? Most companies are exclusively work from home. You know, I'll let you in. Our offices are actually open. You know, we're probably 10 to 20% of people are coming in maybe some of the time, and that number is probably starting to go down. And thanks for the poll results. So I think we have a good mix of people there. You know, I think that for a while, although this has changed a little bit with the announcement of the vaccine, Cisco and Zoom stock was just soaring. I kind of missed the boat on that. But, you know, we spend most of our lives in a conference call now. And I think the certain's become uncertain and very few, if anyone's traveling. And I think, again, for this industry, big change. You know, I was telling Rachel before you guys joined, I used to be in New York probably a week and a half-ish a month. I haven't been to New York since February, which is kind of stunning to me. And I think that's true of a lot of folks. I think what hasn't changed is communication is still king. And I think it's a different mode. But if anything, it's kind of increased in importance. And I think, you know, early days, everyone was probably almost, you know, ultra communicating. And then as this has gone on month over month over month, I think some groups have kept that pace up and other groups probably have dropped off. But for an employee, or I'm sure you guys as students and kind of as consumers of your universities, that's really important because you feel more disconnected. So there's more of a want for communication. Relationships still matter in the industry, in particular that we're in. So, you know, I still get requests from employees saying, hey, you know, I want to go out with my broker and, you know, we want to go out to lunch or something in the city that we're in. Is that okay? And, you know, so I think you have to factor that into the context and what's going on in the greater areas you're in, but the want to kind of connect with people is still really important. Expectation around results, and you know, a lot of people are suffering, whether it's through job loss or whether it's companies are downsizing. You know, the good news for our industry is it hasn't impacted us the same way, and that's one of the great things about insurance and reinsurance is it's pretty resilient and everyone needs it. So pricing might be impacted, individual companies' appetites might be impacted, but the global appetite for insurance is, you know, really as good, if not better, than it has ever been. So I think those results and how companies are managing their risks, that stays constant. And I think there are tons of key learnings for people and companies that are paying attention, some of which I just highlighted. But the things that I see is the appetite for employee development has like skyrocketed. And I think people they're working really hard. They want distractions. So earlier this year, we've rolled out some training. I filled those classes in like 3 minutes, whereas before I'd be, hunting people down in the hall and tackling them to sign up for classes. Now people want more. I think people want to see their leaders. And I think companies that are doing that effectively are getting ahead of that. And I think people want to be viewed as a whole person now. Fortunately, my dogs aren't down here right now because they'd end up barking at some point. But the calls that I've been on, you see people's kids, you see their dogs, you see their Buffalo Bills helmets behind them. People want that whole person view. And I think we have to have patience with all the little technical burps that we'll have along the way. But it's led to more of an appreciation for who you're dealing with and not just somebody on the other end of a line or the other end of a transaction. And ultimately, I think really everything has changed in some way, but I think all of it isn't bad. There's been a lot of positives here, and hopefully you've seen that as well. So that's my COVID bit, if you will. I'm going to ask for another polling question here on virtual environments. So cue this up. I'm going to answer it as well. And we'll see what we get there. All right. And I'm sorry, I'm having a little bit of a lag here with the slides. Thanks, Rachel. Yes, 87%. It has positives and negatives. I think I posted something on LinkedIn about that as well. And Rachel, we may have one of those technical issues. I am not able to shift slides right now.
Would you like to, I can try to share my.
Yeah, you want me to drop my share and you can shift?
Sure, let's try that.
Sorry about that, guys.
Let's see. All right, where were we? Here we go.
Perfect. So I'm going to go through this really quickly because you guys have been living this. But, one of the things that we did early with our employees is we tried to provide some tips because it is really challenging to work from home. As you know, some people love it. Some people hate it. A lot of people are in the middle. I think the key takeaway here is, I'm not going to repeat all these, but, you have to find some balance because I find myself, my computer is always on. It is very easy for me to drift over at 9 o'clock and spend an hour and a half answering emails and stuff. Whereas before, when I'd leave the workplace, I'd shut my laptop and I'd only open it if I have to. When you're at home and it's just there, it's really tempting to keep going to it. So I think scheduling breaks, having your routine to the extent that you can have that. Otherwise, you feel like you're always just in catch-up mode. So we're going to keep going here. So choosing a career in an industry. So a couple of things that I'd say here is industry matters, but also it doesn't. I remember when I interviewed at MetLife earlier in my career, again, insurance industry, I was like, gosh, I really, other than Snoopy, I don't know that I want to do this. I had been in tech and I'd been in publishing, and those were kind of viewed as sexier industries. And then I got in the insurance industry, and what I found was that I could transfer those skills from other industries. And the important thing to me was finding a place where I could learn and develop. And, as an HR person, I wanted people to be the center. And that's kind of true of technology. It's true of publishing. It's definitely true of insurance. The thing that I'd encourage you to do, and the question that I get from students a lot is, well, I don't know if I want to be a claims person. I don't know if I want to be a broker. I don't know if I want to be an underwriter. Where you start doesn't determine where you're going to end in the industry we're in. And I think the great thing is, if you choose another industry other than insurance, doesn't mean that you can't come back. I'll always be finding you on LinkedIn and such. but I think find an industry where the trend is pointed in the right direction. So I started in publishing. I was in trade publishing. Some of the exciting magazines I worked with included Soybean Digest and National Hog Farmer, just to give you a sense. It wasn't Esquire. But it was a cool place because it was all about sales and editorial. And about the year 2000, this thing called the internet started, and we started to lose people to that. And it became very clear that the publishing industry was going to go through some radical change. And that's not why I exited, but it was part of the reason that I exited. Insurance, going back to my earlier comments, we sit here in the middle of the world changing, and at least for Sompo International, we're getting more business than we ever have. We've hired, close to 200 people during the course of the pandemic. It's a really resilient industry, and it's an aging industry. So as somebody coming into that industry, you guys are presented with more opportunities than any, generation before you. So pay attention to those trends. Rachel, we can keep going. Thank you. I think the key in this is match game. Find a company that's in alignment with you, your brand, your values. And as you're looking at whether it's internships or full-time roles or switching from one full-time role to another, I always say define your 3 to 5 non-negotiables, the most important and key things that'll make you happy. And those are going to change over time. Some of them are situational. I've had people before who've had to stay in a city because they had someone in their family that was ill. So location was key to them. I would say some of the things you should consider outside of those things that you can't change are, do you have a person at the company that you're going for? Somebody who you can, confide in, who's going to be responsible for your development and who's going to advocate for you? Do you have the opportunity to learn? Again, are those company values in alignment? Because I've been at companies before, they were terrific companies, but that alignment's been out of whack, and eventually that causes conflicts, usually sooner rather than later. Do they have the kind of role that I want, either now or later? Again, it might be geography. It could be any of those things. So make a list, be deliberate about it, because the mistakes I've made in my career is when I haven't made this list. So think about that, and again, revisit it, because it'll change over time. When you're single, again, location may mean less than when you have a family and the kids are in school. So keep that in mind. As you start out, the thing that I notice, and I interview a lot of folks at all levels, is it becomes very apparent whether somebody knows something about your company or not pretty early, at least in my interview process. So do your homework for yourself, but also for the interview process. Prepare questions, and some of them can be easy, some of them should be hard for planned meetings. And this would even include, if you're going to a networking event. So if Spencer was having a networking event for students and industry professionals are going to be there, have some things in the back of your mind prepared, because sometimes it's hard to think of that on the fly. And I know a number of students on here that I know pretty well, so you guys will have heard this before. My cheat code is follow-up notes, handwritten follow-up notes, because everyone uses email. It's really easy, but like before 8 o'clock today, I had 200 emails. It's really hard for me to differentiate one from another. If I get a follow-up note, it's pretty rare. I actually keep them, and I have them on this board. If I was in my office, you'd see it behind me, but every thank you note or follow-up note I put on this board because I really appreciate them, and not everyone's me, so maybe people don't appreciate them as much, but I guarantee you this, they're not getting many handwritten follow-up notes. So if you have an interaction and somebody that you want to continue that connection with, send a handwritten note. Be patient. Sometimes, again, the best opportunities are the second ones. And sometimes the opportunities take a while to flesh themselves out, particularly in this environment where there's a lot of uncertainty. So don't be afraid to follow up with people. And last but not least, and again, a good cheat code moment is, you probably have this already in their family and friends and maybe professors, but continue to develop a network of trusted advisors. And as you go through your career, you're gonna have these forks in the road decisions, and you're not gonna know what to do. That's who you go to, and they know who you are. And you can say, okay, well, they offered me a promotion to San Francisco. Here are the pluses, here are the minuses, and they're going to be the person who's going to push you a little bit, and maybe unveil some things that you're not thinking about or that you're minimizing. Thanks, Rachel. So what do I look for in candidates? And again, I'm not everyone, so I'll offer this with a caveat, but the good news and the bad news here. The bad news is, and I saw Dave was on this call, and I think I said this when I was at MTSU last time, I don't think they have a class for any of this stuff. So you can't take a course in it. That's the bad news. The good news is they're skills you can develop. They include business acumen, intellectual curiosity, flexibility, having accountability for the decisions that you do make, energy and enthusiasm, and relationship building skills. So when I came out of school, I won't tell you guys how long ago, I didn't have all this. So it's okay if you go, oh my gosh, I have 3 of the 6. You're probably ahead of where I was at your point. But you can develop these skills. And I think, again, as you guys consider this industry, if I look at these skills, it applies to underwriting. It applies to brokering. It applies to claims. It applies to pretty much any role that I can think of in our company, because this is the industry. If I have a risk, if I'm not curious, you're probably not going to price that risk correctly, or you're not going to understand what's driving the insured in terms of what they're looking for in coverage and such. So curiosity is huge for me. Curiosity is huge in the interview process. And I think as you start to look at companies, because if you're not curious, you're probably not going to dig underneath why this is a fit or not. Business acumen, again, I think underwriting is a really cool job personally. Business acumen is at the center of that role. You have to understand the company, the financial environment, the risk, the segment that you're writing the risk against. Flexibility. We're going to be about a 3,500 person company. If I actually wrote down my job description, there'd be this bucket at the end, which would be all the other stuff that I get involved in including, now in the environment of COVID, I'll get calls and people will say, well, an employee was exposed. Who do we need to contact? That's not my job exactly, but it's people oriented. So I think that's the way you should look at these roles, is you're going to get involved in things that are outside the scope of what you do. And the people that say, you know what, I'm just going to figure it out, I'll fill that gap, are going to accelerate their career more quickly. Accountability, we're in the business of risk. So when I make a mistake, I'm accountable for it. That is a tough thing to learn, particularly at the start of your career, having to admit when you make a mistake. That's fine. That's what we do. If you're not making mistakes, you're not trying, just don't make it again and take accountability for it. Don't blame somebody else for it. Energy and enthusiasm. I mentioned earlier, I interview a lot of folks. I'll interview people with 30 years of experience, the most amazing resume you've ever seen. I'll get to the end of the interview and say, hey, do you have any questions? Nope, I'm good. That pretty much tells me they're not interested, or maybe they think they have the job already, or they're just not a fit. Don't underestimate energy and enthusiasm. It'll make up for any gaps in knowledge that you have at the start of your career, and it'll differentiate you throughout your career. And then last but not least, I think the ability to build relationships, and I call it kind of organizational navigation, inside the company and outside the company, depending on your role. You will get to a point in your career where you never have to look for a job again. It'll come through maybe somebody that's already on this call who you got to know, through an old boss, through a contact at a brokerage, and that's all tied together by the relationships you guys have. Once you do start at a company, and I'll pause after this slide, Rachel, just to see if we have any questions. I think work to understand the company and the industry. I'm a big fan of LinkedIn because you can kind of create this feed for yourself, subscribe to every company that's a competitor, subscribe to Spencer, WSIA, Gamma, all the great associations in the industry. And just by reviewing that, you're going to get kind of an instant news feed that's curated for yourself. But outside of that, when you get networking events, ask people questions. The more you understand about the industry, the more informed you're going to be about the decisions you make, both from a job standpoint, from a career standpoint, and just from a whole person standpoint. I think, a lot of you from the poll are in the process of, you're either early in your education or you're finishing up soon. Again, the good news is you're used to learning. Just keep doing it. Do it beyond, reading books and paying attention to what's going on in the industry. Find opportunities to develop outside of work. And, when I was in school, that was probably more of an exception than a rule. When I look at your resumes, I would say you're probably doing that. Keep doing that and find ways to build your skills outside of your day job because it's things that you can transfer to work and to life. And this is my saying, and I've had bosses before that I probably wouldn't tell them this for various reasons, but I think ultimately your job is to make your boss and your company look good. And obviously within reason, you want to have integrity and ethics around that. But if you think of that, and as you're producing a product, it puts things in order, and it'll inform you as to when you're trying to figure out how to fill gaps. If you have a boss who's struggling, okay, well, maybe I can take this from you. And if that's going to help them, it's going to help you, it's going to help the company. It's kind of obvious, but at the same time, in the middle of doing 1,000 things, sometimes it's a good reminder. I would say, and for those of you that are undergrads right now, I'll go out on a limb and say there's this notion about your generation, which I don't believe, that you want things to come faster to you than any generation before you. I don't actually believe that. But the thing that I would say is, if you are looking to progress, which you should be, don't use promotions as the single measure to define yourself and your progression. I see people in our organization and other organizations who are on a lightning fast pace. They're not getting promoted every year, and that's okay because they're getting developed, they're getting recognized, they're getting opportunities. But if I look at my underwriting career path, you can probably have, I don't know, probably 7 promotions over your career in title. But if I look at the iterations of how people are progressing, there are probably 24 opportunities for them to kind of step up that ladder. So if you're at a company and you're not getting promoted fast enough, number one, understand the process. And number 2, don't let the title define you. And don't make a switch for a title. Look at that list of 3 to 5 things that I mentioned earlier. I like to put this up because I think it's a nice barometer. So when I started a company after 12 months, the things that I think you want to say is you're known within your department, within your market, within your company. You've learned how things work within your department, your market, your company. You have a personal and professional development plan, and you're making progress on it. You've graduated in Networking 102, and we'll talk about that in a little bit. But you feel like you're broadening out that network of people. And you found some ways to fill gaps. And I used this term earlier, and I have a good friend at Burns and Wilcox who uses this example of, and this was probably early in the pandemic, they lost some folks, and she had a really junior person, and he called her up and said, you know what, I know we've our Pennsylvania office, a lot of people have left. What can I do to help you? What's going to be the thing that'll keep us afloat? Because I know you're taking on a bunch of responsibility. So find ways to fill those gaps, because as fast as things are moving in this industry, I guarantee you'll have those opportunities. And that's not a new job. It's not a new role. It's something you're kind of doing off the side of your desk, but it's giving you an opportunity to get exposed to something different. And it's you asking for it versus having somebody present it to you, if that makes sense. And I'm going to pause, Rachel. Do we have any questions at this point? I know I've been hitting it pretty fast.
I haven't seen any in the chat, but of course, please feel free to pop one in or unmute yourself and ask now.
And while we're doing that, do we want to do the next polling question, Rachel? Thank you. Thanks, guys, for doing that. We can keep going into networking. And I'm going to wait for the next poll result, but then you can throw the other poll on top of it, Rachel. So perfect. All right, so we have a good mixed bag of people. About almost 2/3 of you have some industry experience. Some don't. I guess before I jump to networking, what I'd say is for those of you that don't have industry experience yet, look, experience is better than no experience, but people are in different situations. So if you don't have the opportunity to intern or get that experience, I'll throw out some ideas for you, whether it's internship for a day, whether it's just networking with industry professionals, there's ways to bridge that gap. And I'm also willing to help with some of that. So we'll talk about that at the end. But shifting to networking. So the poll question, does networking make you anxious? And that can change over time. I think it makes most people anxious. And if you guys have been to a career fair, I think that is by far the most anxiety driven kind of speed dating environment that I can think of. I'm always sitting there. The students will always tell me like, oh my gosh, like you're talking to all these people. I'm like, look, I have it easy. I get to sit on this side of the booth. I remember being on the other side of the booth. It's really hard to make an impression in that setting because you literally, have 2 minutes go and then the next person comes and then the next person and the next person. So again, there are different kind of environments. I would say regardless of what the environment is, consider it a conversation. I'm a big fan of if something makes you nervous, frame it a different way. Something that you're comfortable with. So if it's a conversation, well, big deal. I have conversations all the time. I go to Starbucks, I go to Barnes and Noble, whatever it is. Try to frame it that way for yourself. I know obviously there are different things going on, but start with that. Start small. Again, if you're in a career fair environment, I've seen people do this before and I always appreciate it. They kind of bring a wingman with them and somebody starts doing that talking and then the other person gets a little bit more comfortable and kind of inserts and you can watch someone doing it. Bottom line is have an achievable plan. And, the other example that I think of is you're in this big ballroom and there are like 100 industry professionals and they're all in suits and a bunch of students walk in. Where do you start? Just look for somebody that, doesn't cause you a lot of anxiety and start with that person. Start with some small talk. Who do you work for? Tell me what you do. People like to talk about themselves. And, I had going back to UGA, we were doing a fair there. I think it was last year. And actually she ended up being an intern for us. But one young lady walked up to the booth and in 2 minutes told me more about Sompo International than I'd had any professional tell me. And I mean, it was a level of detail. I was just like, I looked at the underwriter that I was with and I'm like, okay, like chase her down and tackle her and let's take her back to the Alpharetta office because she knew what our CEO did 10 years before. And that's not easy to find. So if you have a target person or a target company, do more research. And again, it's a delicate balance to look like a show off or just to share some information, but this person struck that balance perfectly. And treat it as a starting point. Again, if you get 2, 5, 10 minutes with somebody, you can only do so much, but if you show some interest in them, ask them a few questions, tell them a little bit about you, pretty good starting point. And I think the way to look at networking is it's career development and it's relationship building. So practice makes perfect. Again, when you start, you're probably going to have less skills than where you are now. When I was in your shoes, those environments terrified me. Now I get in one of those rooms and I view it as like, the amazing race. How many people can I talk to? And, as a recruiter, I've got kind of the mixed motive of I want to collect as many people that I can recruit later as possible. But from your standpoint, it could be, hey, I want to collect as many potential career opportunities in the future, or I want to collect as much information so that I can use that as an underwriter or as a broker. Take it on as a little bit of a challenge. Be a professional observer. If you go to someone's office, again, if you notice they have a helmet in their office, maybe, hey, oh, you're a Bills fan. That's something you can start small with and then build off of that. And I think ultimately, again, I've used this a couple times, curiosity and questions, huge cheat code. People like to talk about themselves. Ask them more questions. And, you'll get the cue if it's too many at some point. But most people really like to talk about themselves. And again, practice makes perfect. We can keep going, Rachel. Thank you. Don't be intimidated by who you're speaking to. probably easier for me to say than if you walk into a room and the first person that you speak to is the CEO of a company. But again, go back to what I said earlier. If people are people, then this person has interest, family, passions. So show interest in who you're talking to, and show passion in the industry and the company and what you're talking about. And that pretty much fixes everything. And people notice that. And if you're nervous, they know, it's not a big deal. But reduce it down to, again, it's just a conversation. I don't care what the person's title is. I want to be aware of it, but it shouldn't immobilize you. Also be aware people are not all the same. And I'm down here in Atlanta. I grew up in Buffalo, so I kind of have both views. When I'm in New York, I behave differently than when I'm in Atlanta. I wear a suit in our New York office. In Atlanta, you'll often find me in jeans. When I go to Lubbock, Texas, I'm wearing cowboy boots. So those are the visible differences. But there are some regional differences. The term "bless your heart" might play down here in Atlanta or in Auburn, where I went to school. I'm not using that in New York. There are global differences, and we were acquired by a Japanese company, and I remember when that happened. There's a great book called The Culture Map, by the way, that you should check out about global differences. But one of the things that our executives were really nervous about was, for the most part, none of them had ever been in Tokyo or ever really worked Japanese deals. So they're like, what do we do with our business cards? Do we bow? Do we shake hands? Do we, what if we don't understand somebody? Like, are we going to offend somebody? So you want to be aware of that. But I think what we found, at least in our experience and what I've seen at other companies, is people appreciate you making the effort. You don't have to get everything right, but if you make an effort, or even if you ask a question, did I do that right? People appreciate the consideration. So again, global differences, I would say, do a little bit of homework. Don't expect that you're going to nail it the first time or the second time or the third time. But if you're making an effort and you're respectful, people notice it. And then there are generational differences. Although, again, I minimize those because I go back to the people are people context. But certainly, as we look at deploying technology, as we've looked at work from home, we've seen some of those generational differences manifest themselves. So you want to be aware of those, but again, don't let them immobilize you. Don't be afraid to ask questions. And networking is a two-way street. As you get on LinkedIn, reach out to people, and you guys have license. If I'm linked with a lot of you, if you aren't linked with me, send me a note. I'm always going to accept that. I'm available for questions. Reach out to people on LinkedIn. I think most people will respond, but find opportunities to help others too, or share news feeds and things like that. It should be a two-way street ultimately.
Tony, I have a quick question for you in the chat from Janae Gooch. This is a great question. What are some tips and tricks to stand out in the virtual networking environment, and how should students navigate breakout rooms and other aspects of virtual career fairs?
Yeah, that is a really good question. Yeah, standing out in a virtual environment, there's two ways to stand out. One's a good way and one's a bad way. Don't ignore the bad way. The good way is, I think, treat the virtual environment like you would the live environment. So, and again, I dressed up for you guys, by the way, today. That doesn't happen often. I will wear t-shirts now on some of my conference calls, and people will be like, what's that? So I'm probably sometimes not the best example, but it's been a long time. So I think, dress like you would in a face-to-face, ask questions, follow up. So I don't think it's any different, which is, I know, challenging. But I think stick to blocking and tackling, and don't let the virtual environment make you skip steps. In terms of breakout rooms and things like that, what I would say is, again, one of the things that we've seen is people are wired differently with regard to virtual environments. So some people are as present as they would be if it was a face-to-face environment. Some people are not. So again, it's basic stuff. It's being present. It's asking questions. It's being active. Again, if if there's time to kind of ask questions, you want to get your curiosity sated, but at the same time, if you're sharing kind of airspace with other people, not overtake the whole session. So strike that balance. But I'd say, again, good news, bad news. I don't think it's that different from a regular environment. You have to strike that balance and make sure that you're getting the opportunity to get across what you need to. Any other questions, Rachel, or are we going to keep going?
That's all I have in the chat at the moment, but again, encouraging everyone on the call, please feel free to pop any and all questions.
Okay, good. We seem to be doing pretty good from a time standpoint, so let's keep going to branding. And let's go to that last poll question, if you don't mind, Rachel. So some stats while we get the polling stats in. It takes 5 to 7 impressions to remember a brand. 75% of HR departments search online for candidates. And I'll talk about that here in a sec. People have 10 times more followers than companies. All right, and I see about 60% are working on it, which I'd expect. 25% are uncertain, and 17% have their brand nailed. Messages are shared 24 times more frequently when posted by an employee. So I love our marketing department. They've quickly figured out, and I think actually one of those folks is online right now. So I give them props. They do a great job posting company information about Sompo International. But I think some of them have figured out that I'm pretty active on LinkedIn. Some might call it almost, a habitual addiction to LinkedIn. So when something posts, I'll get a call once in a while, and the head of marketing, Carol, call me up and she goes, "Did you repost that article about the executive we hired?" And I'm like, yeah, I did. And this is part of the reason why it means something different from when you as an employee post something versus the company posts something. It just gets a different audience level and probably a broader following. Similarly, leads developed by employees convert 7 times more frequently. All of this is to say company brands matter, individual brands matter more in so many ways. So we're going to talk a little bit about that.
I have one question for you, Tony, from John. Building on the last question, what are some tips on relationship building and expanding your network, especially when every verbal meeting is virtual now?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I think the key is you do it a couple ways, and I appreciate where you guys are sitting now because like I'm active with Gamma and WSIA, and so there were conferences, and we'd get this opportunity to kind of connect. I'd get to connect with students that I might only connect with on LinkedIn or through one of these sessions, and it's different. You get a more robust experience out of that. I don't think anyone would argue that. So in the absence of that, what I'd say is continue to take advantage of stuff like this. And reach out to people. So start maybe with a LinkedIn invite, or if you have an email address, a quick follow-up note, or again, a handwritten follow-up note. Ask for, for the folks that you particularly are targeting, ask for, 15 minutes if you can get on the phone and ask some additional questions and get some one-on-one time. Use LinkedIn. Use the opportunities that your universities present to you, and build those networks, and it's going to feel a little transactional at first where you're just accumulating kind of connections, but then you can target specific ones to build that out more. But what I find is more and more folks are on LinkedIn, so starting there and using that as a building block is a real effective way to broaden your network in a shorter amount of time. And, if you can personalize those notes, LinkedIn is great. And you'll see me out there, like I'm the person who's, sending people happy birthday notes. And when they switch companies, sending them those notes, and LinkedIn will give you kind of a form fill in on that, but then you can edit from there. So if you can personalize those notes, again, it's another opportunity to differentiate yourself. And then I think when you do get FaceTime, whether it's this FaceTime or we return to a more normal, that's the opportunity to really have a more robust discussion than, again, some of the social media and other interactions. Thank you. That was a really good question. So what is your brand? So we had, roughly, 17% who said they had it all figured out. I will say this, that's good. And I think there are people that have it figured out, but I think it will continue to evolve. And if you don't have it sorted, or you were one of those 1 out of 4 people who said, yeah, I don't even know what my brand is, that's okay. When the whole topic of branding came up, and again, I'll use LinkedIn as an example, I got all these requests and people are like, oh, I do personal branding, like reach out to me. And I was like, oh, this feels like so, gauche and manufactured. And then what I realized is it really starts with your values and it's what you're good at. So like when I think of people in our operation, and again, I go to underwriting because I have an affection for that function. I think of this one underwriter who is like, if I could put you all through the kind of Ray lab and take all the good things that he does, I think those are traits that I see in really good underwriters. So what you're good at is really your brand, and how you operate and what your values are, I think, is the other part of it. So I'd say start writing it down. And it's that old question that you probably have gotten already if you've interviewed for internships or even just professional jobs or high school jobs. What are your strengths and what are your weaknesses? Hate that question. But to some degree, it is, what are your strengths and what are your weaknesses? What are the things that you're good at? And what are the things that you don't like doing? That kind of becomes your brand. And over time, keep paying attention to that. I mean, my brand to a large extent is, and I'll be the first person to say, like, HR is a tough space. I don't, I tell people at parties, they'll say, so what do you do? Well, I work for an insurance company, and that'll clear about half the room. But what specifically do you do in insurance? I'm in HR. They'll be like, I'm out of here. Like, the only thing worse is a lawyer. So, I'm the HR person who gets to know people. That's what I'm passionate about. I love talent. That's kind of part of my brand. You guys will evolve that way too as you build your career. So start writing it down. Find ways to project it. Again, I don't work for LinkedIn. I don't get any royalties from them, but it's a real effective way to project what you're interested in. So the things that you post, the things that you comment on, that, if you can do original material, even if it doesn't have to be outstanding, it can be just something you're passionate about. It doesn't even have to be work oriented. I'm working on something about how much I love the city of Buffalo, New York, that I'll post up there. Whatever it is, it gets attention and it tells people who you are. Do it within your company, and do it at industry events. There are all kinds of opportunities. And again, we're going to get out of COVID and it's going to kind of return somewhat to normal, but there are tools out there that can allow you to do that even now.
Tony, cycling back to LinkedIn, we have a question from Gracie Ray from Middle Tennessee State University. In regards to LinkedIn, what are some tips and tricks for emerging graduates that attract employers to look at your profile more often?
Yeah, thanks, Gracie. Gracie and I talk a good bit, so I'm excited you're on here. So I would say this: number one, if you don't have a profile, put one up there. And again, if you don't have a lot of work experience, that's okay. Put your extracurricular activities on there. And I think, everyone that has a LinkedIn profile, it's fine, but again, it's not going to differentiate you. I think you differentiate yourself by what you like, what you post, and how you operate within LinkedIn. So again, reaching out to people, sharing information, asking them questions. But in an environment where people aren't going to be able to see that, what I'd suggest is you find opportunities to project your interest. And, one of the great ways, if you're comfortable with it, is put up your own material. Even if it's just a comment on something, you don't have to write an article. Sometimes it's just, hey, there's this news story, I want to comment on my thoughts on it. And you have to be careful with that. I'd stay away from the classic things, politics, religion, controversial issues, because you can only win or lose there. But the stuff that you're passionate about, that's happening in the industry, or that's happening with, an association that you're working with, or an extracurricular activity, or just something, pop culture-ish that, again, is kind of neutral and not controversial, that's an opportunity for you to project that brand. So that's what I'd suggest. Thanks for the question. Okay, so brand management. You guys have probably heard this before. Brands take years to establish and one day to damage. So I'd encourage you to be thoughtful about your actions. And that's, again, you guys are well ahead of, I think, previous generations. And you probably have had the social media talk 1,000 times by now. But be cautious about what you post on any social media. It never disappears. And I personally am not a big fan of, I've had companies approach me and go, oh, we can do social media searches on anyone you interview. I don't really want to get to that point, but don't mistake the fact that our hiring managers, and sometimes even me, will actually look at that stuff. Similarly, perception becomes reality. So I think early in careers, and I'll use an example, our industry is really social, hence my little comment about alcohol coming up. But you'll get opportunities to go to, again, trade shows, business dinners, drinks, Top Golf. I could keep going on. And usually there will be alcohol there. And if you're legal at that point, you can certainly take advantage of that. What I've seen is sometimes early in careers and sometimes later in careers, people go back to the I want to fit in mode of social networking. And, they'll be the last person at the bar, or they'll want to keep drinking because one of their senior executives is drinking the entire time. Don't be that person. I always say use the club soda trick. And for every drink that you have, I'd probably have 2 club sodas. And different people handle alcohol different ways. And if you don't drink, it's okay too. But I think regardless of whether it's alcohol related or whether it's just trying to fit in, be cognizant that perception becomes reality. So don't presume that someone's titled means they know best. I could tell you 100 stories throughout my career of people going out, and the worst behaved person was one of the most senior people. Which isn't a good story to tell, but it happens. That's a good example when you don't follow the leader. And don't be afraid to walk away. If you're at the point where you just don't feel comfortable, find a graceful way to exit. And I'm not saying any of this to scare you guys, because 99 out of 100 interactions are going to be positive, but it's the one that isn't that everyone remembers. And similarly, you're going to get access to confidential information. Keep it confidential. Don't become known as the person who has loose lips. And if you do ever get into a situation where you're put in an ethical dilemma, know when to take a stand. And we can think of, particularly over the past year, 100 examples of situations where you go, why didn't anyone say anything? You go back to that network of trusted advisors. Have your network of trusted advisors, and when you get in this situation, those are the people you should speak to. And I've been in situations where I've had to say to people, I do not feel comfortable with this. And that's a tough stand to take, but I'd feel less comfortable not saying anything at all. And I don't mean to say all that again to kind of scare you guys or end on a down note, but I want you to be cognizant of manage your whole career and don't create damage to yourself, either trying to fit in or trying not to rock a boat when maybe it needs to be rocked. Okay. So I promised I wouldn't end on that note. So building a career, it takes time, and be patient. And again, what I'd say to you guys, all of you have expressed an interest in this industry. You are in the best position of anyone before you. So you're not going to have to be that patient, truthfully, but there are times where you're going to have to be patient. Be thoughtful, find some opportunities to, again, build a career, build a brand, build your skills. Be curious. Curiosity. I'll take curiosity over knowledge 99 times out of 100, because curiosity leads to knowledge. The people that aren't curious already think they know everything, and that's not going to work for any of us. It's a two-way street. When you network, find opportunities to help other people. Be really protective of what you build. And again, have your people. I know I beat that drum a couple times, but I think it's really important. All right, well, you've asked some questions. I'm going to stop talking and answer any additional questions we have at this point. I know we're coming close to time.
While we're waiting, Tony, I have one for you, which I feel that you've answered throughout this session. But for example, we just sat in an hour room together in a webinar. We saw some faces, we saw some names. If you're a participant in exactly this session, what would you do once you leave?
I would connect with people, and I don't know to the extent, Rachel, that you guys provide everyone with who's on the call, or if we can do that. I will say, number one, if you reach out to me, if you guys have questions you don't want to answer here, please reach out to me. It's a favorite part of my job is to help other people. So I'm happy to do that. But I think, number one, hopefully take some nuggets out of this. Hopefully you had at least one, and apply it. And number two, this is an opportunity to network. When I'm in a session like this, I try and figure out an effective way to kind of jot down all the names of people, and then I'll, stalk you on LinkedIn or some other way if I don't have contact information, because you know something that I don't.
Great, thanks, Tony. And if anyone wants to reach out to me as well, as I have those contacts, please feel free to do so. More than happy to share. Great. Lena said, great gems of information, very helpful. Thank you.
I have a quick question, Tony, if I may.
Sure.
So several times you mentioned like having that network of trusted people, which I think is super key. But how do we determine who we include in that network of trusted people, and how do we make those relationships with our trusted individuals?
Yeah, good question, Noah. I think at this point where I'd start is, you have some family and friends, and maybe students that you know really well, or professors. I think start with your sphere of influence right now, and maybe there are certain questions that go to certain people over time. But like as I think about how mine evolved, I started with that group. And then my first job, I picked up somebody, and I have a boss there who I still keep in contact with. And then my second job, I picked someone else. I think, particularly from a professional standpoint, as you get into one company, you want someone at your company in there, but you don't want too many someones at the company, because they're going to have blind spots and maybe some conflicts of interest in some of the things you might bring them. So you want it to be as diverse as possible and evolve. And, I probably have, a kind of a subcommittee of probably 5 people right now. And then I probably have 20 people that are on the total list. And again, there's no magic to that. But again, I'll kind of pick and choose depending on the topic area. But I have a tight network of probably 5 people that on the really tough ones, that's who I go to. So I think make it diverse, but they have to be people that really know who you are. So it's going to take time too. So don't, if it stays family and friends for the first 4 or 5 years of your career, that might be okay. Does that make sense?
Yes, thank you.
No problem. Good to see you.
You too.
Awesome. Well, we are at exactly the 2 o'clock mark Eastern time. So I'm just going to wrap up. And Tony, I want to say thank you again so much for joining us. Like you said, this was just a presentation chock full of little nuggets. I hope everyone on the call today can take at least one of those, if not a plethora of them home with them. Again, please feel free. You all have my email address through the invite that was sent out. So if you want to contact me to get in touch with Tony or someone else, etc., at Spencer, we're always happy to help you with this networking piece. So please feel free to reach out. I also want to give a really quick shout out to Robin Fond, also at Sompo International, for really being the person behind the scenes and coordinating all this. So thank you very much, Robin. And Tony, once more, thank you for being
thanks,
here today.
Rachel, for all the support, and thanks everyone for making the time, and happy holidays to all of you.
Happy holidays, everyone. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye now.
Thank you and happy holidays.